Welcome to the next chapter of Unspoken Journeys. I'm just on the seashore here, and we're looking across at the port of Larne. I'm also on the coast road here as well, so hopefully we'll hear more sea than we do road in the background. There was a time before personal computers, before mobile phones, and in our house, before fitted carpets and colour TV. This was known as the 80s. I started secondary school in 1979, and before ever turning 12, this new era was upon me. There was no escaping the fact that to experience one's youth in that time was different to anything that had gone before, or indeed afterwards. This decade saw innovations such as video, commonly known as VHS or Betamax back then, MTV, a 24-hour music TV channel that launched in 1981, compact discs, and the first personal computers. And they weren't all-consuming as much as technology is today. Although it was an exciting time of fast-moving societal change and innovation, as youngsters, the majority of enjoyment was sought outdoors. In fact, when I think back to my youth, while there was time for television and music, we spent far more time seeking out other sorts of enjoyment. Until my mid-teens, bicycles and skateboards were the main form of transport, and at the time they featured in every risk-taking stunt imaginable. I remember setting up ramps to jump other kids, logs or even piles of straw on fire. We mostly stuck to footpaths, fields and farm tracks, but we all rode around together in a pack, inquisitively exploring new places to go and new things to do. The early years were not without mishap. There were occasions when we were chased from places we shouldn't have been, and times when we were just injured from being out of control. Although this kind of activity was never welcomed by our parents, there were many things we got up to that weren't actively discouraged either. One of the craziest things we got up to on bicycles when we were younger was cycling 250 miles from Bedford to Westward Ho in Somerset. There was no way anyone of our ages would be allowed to do what we did. Even in the age of mobile phones. I'll reread that. There was no way anyone of our ages would be allowed to do what we did. Today, even in the age of mobile phones. I was the eldest at 16, but my friend was 15, and my 14-year-old brother came along too. Our parents agreed to meet up with us 5 days later, but until that time we were completely on our own, with only a map and a list of campsite destinations for each night stopover. By the time I was 14, I already had a number of 50cc mopeds and larger engine off-road motorcycles, which I was able to use in the field behind a house and beyond. The hours we spent riding around the fields and farm tracks during those warm summer evenings were not only unforgettable, they made us feel like the luckiest kids for miles around. This off-road transport took us as far as the next village, where we often met up with school friends. In many ways, the time we spent on two-wheeled motorised transport was no different to bicycles, inasmuch as we still got up to the same stunts and mischief. As I recall this, I have to mention the time we raced down a concrete farm track, 3 up on a 125cc trial bike. After all hanging on for dear life, we stopped so I could try a wheelie or two. But as I did, the front wheel flew off. Although a little shocking, this was typical of the thrills and spills we were used to back then. As soon as I was 16, my dad took me to a local motorcycle dealer to get my own proper road-going 50cc Yamaha, which was when real adventures began. Some family friends who lived in Uxbridge had children the same age as myself and my brother, and within a few months we arranged to meet up. Although I now had road transport. This was 1984, which was still well before the age of affordable mobile phones. In fact, by this time, my parents still had no landline telephone, so the 70-mile journey to the west of London was not only a lonely one, but was without any support. Maybe things were different back then. Maybe my parents trusted others more. It certainly was different and more acceptable to let youngsters go exploring for hours on end. Although somehow I have a feeling that when my eldest reaches 16, I won't be encouraging a 70-mile journey to London with or without accompanying friends and a mobile phone. That being said, my somewhat naive parents gave me the opportunity to explore and experience freedoms that many others didn't, and as a result, I consider myself very lucky. A few days after my 17th birthday, I began to take the few driving lessons I needed to pass my driving test. This was the beginning of a whole new chapter where every car I drove would be tested to its limits and new adventures would be realised. Every sole adventure and experience I had up to that point was training for what laid ahead behind the wheel of a motor car. I soon discovered that a car was much like an item of clothing. It made you look good and feel good, or not. The way it was driven, its cleanliness, the music played, the generosity of the number of rides given to friends, became an extension to one's personality. In essence, my popularity and ultimately the pulling power for friends and girls depended on the ambience created in the car itself, so I made sure I gave it my all. A ride in my car was an experience that took you places, and on occasion, this meant actually driving somewhere. Previous to this, I'd only owned a bedroom, but now I had a room on wheels, somewhere to impress and entertain my friends. While some would be cautious after passing their driving test, not straying too far from home, I was the complete opposite. I passed my test on a Wednesday, and by the weekend I'd purchased a 1970s 1500cc Hillman Avenger for £140 and was ready to go. I certainly started the way I meant to go on, as my very first day of driving was a spontaneous and reckless one. I drove to a local village where my friends would hang out in the local bus shelter, having little better to do. Without stopping, I slowly drove past with the windows down and shouted, "Who wants to come to London?" which was some 50 miles away. This was my first car, first time driving alone, and first time I had driven in London. Even at 17, I didn't do things by halves. I was a seize the day, maximum exhilaration, maximum experience junkie. In many respects, this continues today, or at least when I get the opportunity. By 10 p.m. on Friday night, I had already navigated central London, even though it was completely unfamiliar. And by the early hours, a few friends and I were parked on top of a Heathrow Airport multi-storey car park, marvelling at the planes coming into land. Back in the 80s, you were able to drive into the car parks without a fee and get a great view of the runways unchallenged, which is certainly not the case today. When I think back to the excitement and adventure of those early driving years, it always makes me smile. Now and again, when I hear a song on the radio, it transports me back in time and has even been known to cause a tear or two. Madonna, Get Into the Groove, Crazy for You, Tina Turner, We Don't Need Another Hero, Queen, It's a Kind of Magic album, Jackie Graham, Round and Around, Phil Oakley, Together in Electric Dreams, ELO, Out of the Blue album, Aha, Hunting High and Low album, to name but a few. I never have been the type of person who is satisfied with just the ordinary things in life, so when I think back to the experiences and discoveries of youth, I always seem to recall stories that cause others to say, "I can't believe you did that." However, the circle of friends I spent my youth with was similar to me in many ways, always on the lookout for adventure, and never shy of trying something new. If one word encapsulates those early days, while in no way attributing blame to my parents, it was unchallenged. Once we were out of sight, away from the house and up to our own devices, absolutely nothing was off limits. Cars and motorbikes were tested to their limits and way beyond to destruction. Working in the motor trade was great for knowing how to repair vehicles, but also it was an easy way of getting hold of a wrecker truck to pull our cars out of ditches. We each had a number of cars, and as we drove around, would point out where the latest off-road incident had occurred. It wasn't only cars we were reckless. We were reckless with most things: our money, our belongings, and our life choices. At 16, I remember riding home in the evening after an event at our secondary school where we collected our exam results and were issued with the certificates to prove it. We were so crazy back then, high on life and everything it had in store for us, that we tore up the certificates as we rode along together, laughing. Being there in the moment, enjoying our definition of freedom, setting our own trends, was far more important than any future that lay ahead. There was nothing greater than us and the friendships we had created, and we weren't about to let our future education or employment define who we were or would become. In every sense, we were totally consumed by everything around us. Our cars, our music, our clothes, our girlfriends, nothing was more important. It was commonplace to stay out to the early hours, and we would often be out driving until it got light or be found asleep in a lay-by somewhere. If we weren't sleeping in cars, we would crash round a friend's house or on occasion camp out with friends in a farmer's field. I remember one night camping beside a wood where we lit a fire and with a couple of bottles of wine had a whale of a time. The highlight of this particular night was being frightened to death by something scampering around near the tent in the early hours of the morning. We couldn't decide whether it was rats, ducks, or something else, and this caused so much commotion that it roused the attention of occupants of a nearby house, who approached shouting and waving a torch. An instant midnight exodus meant the campsite was abandoned until we returned the next day, when we collected what we had left behind. And the duck rats, as they became known, featured heavily in stories of midnight camping adventures and strange creatures that could be heard in the undergrowth. Apart from cars, motorbikes and girls, there was a lack of leisure facilities in the immediate vicinity of our local village, and because of this, most evenings would be spent sitting in the bus shelter, which was the focal point for most of the village's youth. However, just outside the village was a small reservoir created by our local farmer and fenced off with clearly marked private property signs. Of course, this was no deterrent, so in the summer months we would occasionally visit for a dip. I never remember anyone deliberately turning up with trunks or a swimsuit, and we would strip down to our underwear instead. The lack of swimsuit was probably because at a moment's notice we may have to throw our clothes back on and make a run for it. On occasions, depending on the company, we took everything off and enjoyed the thrill of skinny dipping. However, mixed swims were short-lived, as some of the boys told tales on the school bus of which girls they had seen, and the nude event remained as a topic of conversation for some time afterwards. The boys, of course, couldn't give a toss that anyone knew they were nude, but the girls thought twice before going all the way in the future. Exhilaration, fun, and experimentation were the name of the game. If we had never tried something, the experience was up for grabs, and one by one most of us had a go. Whether it was smoking, sex, or drugs, such as tripping out on magic mushrooms or even hyperventilating till we fainted, the experiences were seen as rites of passage, and not doing something didn't ever seem like a choice. Personally, however, after overdoing it with some homemade elderflower wine at 16, Any future experimentation was done cautiously and in moderation. While I personally may have been a little timid, the group of teens I hung around with seemed to know no limitations and got up to all the things kids got up to, sometimes alone and on occasion in full view of everyone watching. At this point, it's better not to go into detail, except to say that 20 of us playing strip poker together was just seen as mild, titillating fun. If there was any evidence required to prove that we were youth of the 80s, it was that the term inappropriate was unknown to us. Apart from embarrassment, some experimentation was downright dangerous, and we rarely decided we had taken things too far. For a joke, any of us would, while driving, ask the passenger to hold the steering wheel while we left the driving seat and jumped into the back of the car. Another version of this was when, at considerable speed, we would climb out of the driver's window, again into the back seat of the car, but via the outside. Thrills and spills weren't awful accidents, but badges of honour. And so when my brother crashed his Suzuki on a sharp bend, ending up in a ditch, he became quite a star. The whole incident was seen by two friends out walking, who rushed to his aid and congratulated him on how amazing it looked. Later that night, the story was retold a number of times of how this amazing incident took place. We once decided we would explore a derelict bungalow, as it had been uninhabited for many years. Once inside, we took turns putting the frighteners up each other and in saying that we could hear someone coming. At one point, we were all convinced we should leave and decided to get out quick. Some of us were inside and others had clambered onto the roof. In the panic, a friend jumped off the roof and landed on a reinforced concrete coal bunker, which collapsed as he hit it. As he clambered out, it was obvious that he'd been injured and was clutching his neck. It became evident as we ran home across the fields that his injured neck turned out to be a severe puncture wound, now pouring with blood. It looked so bad that at the time we actually thought he would die and that we would end up in a lot of trouble. Luckily, this turned out to be a story to add to the catalogue of near misses. During my youth, I actually used to believe that although something was dangerous, we had a safe way of going about it. For example, we used to love lighting fires in order to explode as many aerosol cans as possible. My mum would often tell us off for blowing up a brand new can of polish or fly spray. Sometimes they made such an explosion that the sound could be heard right through the village. I told a friend from school what we'd been up to, and he decided to have a go. Although somehow he ended up walking back to it as the can exploded and hit him in the eye. This kind of thing never happened to us, as when we knew something was dangerous, we treated it with the respect it deserved. At the edge of the village, there was a medical facility which had large bottles of compressed air and oxygen. I was convinced that one of these would make the mother of all explosions and carried the heavy object off into the middle of a local wood. I made a fire, threw it on and cycled home as fast as I could. But unfortunately, there was no distant thud to be heard. Although this was a failure, I thought perhaps this had been a little too dangerous and decided to keep the experiment to myself. By the time of my late teens, I had begun to carry out soul adventures. I just realised while I'm talking here, the tide is coming in. By the time of my late teens, I'd begun to carry out soul adventures. Although I would travel alone on foot, bicycle or motorbike, the journeys by car were by far the most exciting. I absolutely loved driving alone in London and would set off in the late evening to deliberately get lost amongst the many lanes and lights. It was such a contrast to the quiet country roads and sleepy villages, and I found the whole experience mesmerising. I drove in London many times with friends, or alone, enough to be able to find my way around. I could easily find all the tourist spots like Buckingham Palace, Tower Bridge and Leicester Square, but as well as that, I could also find the back streets of Chinatown and Soho. I would often abandon my car in a side street and go on walkabouts to sample the atmosphere. In the busy places like Trafalgar Square or Covent Garden, it was safe to be alone, but if you took a wrong turn, you could find yourself being approached by some unsavoury characters. Although some areas were less safe or less desirable, I loved the character and atmosphere of all of them. I would often drive around central and West London until the small hours of the morning, with the window down as I reached the busy areas. There was nothing more exciting than sampling the sounds of Regent Street and Piccadilly Circus at 2 o'clock in the morning. I never really shared the way driving through London made me feel. It was my experience, my own enjoyment, and I loved it. Eventually, when overcome with tiredness, I would head north and find the North Circular Road and take the A1, A10 or M11 some 60 miles north back home to bed. My lone adventures to London during the weekend or late at night paved the way for future pursuits. I had proved myself that I could go it alone in the middle of London, and now this made other adventures seem less of a challenge. Although I didn't realise it at the time, these early years of adventure, excitement and pushing the boundaries set the scene for what would happen next. London was to be nothing compared to my future adventures. But pre-1994, I was oblivious to what laid ahead. So that's the end of that chapter. And the tide has come in a lot. So I've now got to work my way back to the camera, which is perched on a rock, without getting wet feet again. Thank you for listening.